There are many people walking around like zombies when they commute to work, for instance, preoccupied with their lives, checking their phones and wading through busy streets on autopilot. And they can be logical with what they are focusing on, but they certainly take their reality for granted and don't question its nature. They lack what is required for the practice of lucid dreaming. And when they happen upon a lucid dream for the first time, after noticing that something is off about their surroundings, such moments of clarity and critical thinking can quickly dissipate. When it comes to having an optimal lucid dream, there are only two main challenges. Avoiding a premature awakening, which can be done by intensifying the senses and having a handy plan of action to prevent hesitation, and preserving lucidity by occasionally reminding yourself that it is all a dream and being careful to not be sucked into irrational plots when interacting with certain dream figures. If you know the risks that could end the experience, then you have all the logic you need to circumvent them. All of this is possible in a lucid dream. In a lucid dream, you don't assume what you experience is waking life. You know that it only feels physically real and you may explore it, like a kid having fun playing with dolls and sandcastles, all the while being aware that he or she is playing with imagination. Now, this analogy can only take us so far when it comes to dreaming, because oniric percepts aren't just based on one's imagination. Dream content reflects a subconscious reservoir of memories, concepts, emotions, feelings, and thoughts about all those things. If anything, dreams can reveal the human mind to be a confusing jungle of experiences begging to be deciphered or understood. Not too long ago, I had a dream where a threatening giant spider defecated everywhere and hid when I bravely, but with some trepidation, set out to kill it. Then events became vague, but the plot was along the lines of seeking help and advice from several people, which frustrated me because I felt like I was getting nowhere. Finally, I became lucid before a Christopher Lloyd look-alike. Even though I realized I was dreaming, I asked this character who he was, and he replied with a smile, "Wisdom, don't take everything people say at face value." Subsequently, I felt like hugging him, so we embraced. He felt very comforting before I woke up. Now, I am unable to decipher every single detail of that sleep experience, and I have no clue about the symbolism behind the fearsome arachnid and the act of defecation, but I know how the oniric events made me feel and what thoughts they evoked. Some aspects can be deeply meaningful and reflect back to me what I wish for, such as wisdom, whilst some features just show me what's been on my mind lately, such as a Christopher Lloyd look-alike being a perceptual representation of my wish to re-watch the Back to the Future trilogy as of late. I also woke up from that brief moment of oniric lucidity feeling emotionally good, like something had been resolved, but not knowing exactly what. Perhaps the sense of resolution came from the fact that the dream showed me where my mind was at the time, but I can't be sure. I often feel like so many thoughts and possibilities are being constantly generated by my monkey mind. The Christopher Lloyd look-alike also had a very relaxing demeanour. It wasn't just his words that spoke to me. It was also like he was urging me to not worry so much, as though he was gently making me realise I was the source of my own hang-ups. It was somehow liberating, even though not a lot was said. So a stark reality of meaning exists beyond the mere manifestation of symbols or appearances, which include the limitations of language. As Franz Kafka once said, all language is but a poor translation. This meaning rests on the only reality that cannot be doubted or confused with anything, and the reality that cannot be doubted is consciousness. Anything beyond that, such as the materialist assumption that there exists a world outside of minds, is mere speculation. All you have is your own mind, the contents of your consciousness as they personally present themselves. all appearances in your field of awareness, such as sensations, emotions, thoughts, memories, etc. The veil of perception only allows one to conjecture indirect realism at best, but this cannot be concretely substantiated. If, like in the movie The Matrix, the absolute reality is one we cannot currently perceive, which projects what we do actually perceive, then our quote-unquote reality is basically the one we can interact with directly. We only apply the illusion adjective when we posit that our assumptions about the nature of what surrounds us is wrong, such as assuming that there is nothing underpinning the apparent surroundings when there might be. For instance, if I'm in a vivid dream and believe I am actually perambulating the waking world because the objects I feel with my hands appear to be solidly real, then I am experiencing an illusion. The dream is an illusory world only when I am mistaken about its true nature. If, on the other hand, I am lucid dreaming, aware that I'm dreaming, then I see right through the illusion because I realize the reality of what is perceived is nothing but a sleep hallucination. We must be careful to not conflate illusion with non-existence. If you come to know for sure the nature of what you are perceiving after having been mistaken, then you have shattered the illusion. Often people get flummoxed by semantic misunderstandings, and arguments of this nature tend to become circular because they hinge on the controversial definition of real. The dream is real in its own way, just not of the same nature as waking life. In a similar vein, the computer-generated simulation of the Matrix is real in its own way, but also an illusion to the people who have been deceived by it, because they think it is all there is and of the same gross nature as the real. It's an illusion or deception because people don't know its true nature, which is that it's computer-generated, nothing but informative electrical impulses fed to the brain as encoded by a complex matrix. I would also like to clarify what is really meant by concepts like non-duality and anatta, the non-self state or the no-self state. You either have a dual mode of looking at things, where you separate yourself from the world, or you realize the non-duality inherent in reality once you break the illusion of separation and dichotomies. I think a lot gets lost in translation as people tend to make exaggerations. What was originally meant by anatta was merely the cessation of personal identity, the mental fiction of the story of us, how we have conceptualized ourselves as having a name and being associated with the world in certain ways as people. This doesn't mean that the true self, meaning pure consciousness, goes away. You see why I said people get semantically confused. As Alan Watts once said, the biggest ego trip is getting rid of your ego, and of course the joke of it all is that your ego does not exist. For instance, when you watch a mind-blowing movie like The Matrix, you probably temporarily forget yourself, or your sense of self is diminished, or you are not focusing on the narrative of anything to do with you. But you are absolutely having a visual, auditory and emotional experience as you watch the film. This is because primarily you are consciousness, and consciousness has become or is identifying with the rich experience of the movie. Even though you have kind of forgotten that you exist as a person with a name in those moments, there is still an experience. Experience equals consciousness in this sense. The consciousness that we are has unlimited potential to become anything, or to conceptually identify as being anything. When people talk about anatta, and they say there is no self, they really mean personal identity or the fictional story of I. So they say, in that sense, that the self is an illusion because it's not what we truly are. It's a very poor choice of words in play here. The real sense of I, which never goes away because it is the foundation of existence itself, is consciousness. Consciousness is prior to the concepts and the stories about ourselves. I can say that I am Arlindo as much as I want, and that I live in the United Kingdom, and people think I'm a bit of a nutcase, but that's not truly who I am at the core. I could suffer a head injury that wipes out that narrative of self-identification. I could forget who I'm supposed to be in this world, but something about me hasn't gone away. What has remained is consciousness. In dreams, I can forget many things about waking life and believe that I'm a different person in the context of a mindless dream plot. But I never cease to be the real me in terms of conscious experience, in terms of being a witness. And upon awakening, I can remember that dream and chuckle at the fact that I had false memories and believed myself to be somebody else, compared to whom I remember myself to be respectively. Self-identifications are transient. They are illusions of who we apparently are. Consciousness persists throughout, and therefore is the only real identity that cannot be doubted. Now, here's another point. Nobody knows what happens after death. Under philosophical idealism, we come to realize that experience is continuous because consciousness is fundamental and thus the wellspring of reality. But what kind of experience awaits us is a serious question. Clues may be found in near-death experiences, anagrammatically known as NDEs, because more and more people are reporting rich mystical experiences as we are now medically able to bring them back well past the old point of no return. It may well be different for everyone with some typical similarities. Perhaps we end up being completely seduced by the commonly reported loving, peaceful light. It is also common to travel through a tunnel to meet deceased loved ones after having an out-of-body experience. Perhaps at the new point of no return, we wake up from the dream of life, as it were, only to subsequently reincarnate and forget what came before. This speculation is in the spirit of what the psychedelics investigator Havelock Ellis once said. Dreams are real as long as they last. Can we say more of life? Maybe some reach nirvana and escape the so-called wheel of samsara. It is still a mystery even in idealist metaphysics. Perhaps lucid dreamers will fare really well in the afterlife. I think, if I recall correctly, as part of dream yoga, it is a Tibetan Buddhist belief. Lucid dreaming is supposed to keep you focused. Maybe there are angels who reveal what's beyond this world to a few of us, like Edward Swedenborg, who predicted his own death and said he was, quote-unquote, going on vacation and not coming back. An abundance of reports also suggests that consciousness is intrinsically blissful in its purity. This bliss is the main driver of evolution. Hence why every living creature seeks pleasurable states and peace in their struggle to self-preserve. We may all have different minds, but we share one consciousness because this one is only one phenomenon. Some creatures have a very short stay here compared to humans that can potentially become centenarians. Cats and dogs live between 10 to 20 years on average. Some insects or bugs only last weeks, if not days. Once we are done, we return to the source. We go home, so to speak, until perhaps the next adventure as something or something else, or someone else. Consciousness is always the ground. Nancy Rhines, whom I mentioned before, had an NDE where she was reminded that she planned and chose her life on Earth. which she refers to as her near-life experience. Perhaps this isn't as crazy as it sounds when we realise that consciousness, as even Sir Roger Penrose postulated recently, precedes all manifest life. And if consciousness is the wellspring of reality, in a sense, as the one consciousness, Nancy did manifest her life and her personal identity on Earth, but forgot who she truly is once she was born, only to be reminded of it at a later stage during her NDE. I suspect NDE patients are perceiving the light of consciousness in its wholesome nature, the oneness about it. That's why, in many NDEs, the light refers to itself in both the singular and plural, often telling the near-dead, I love you, we love you. Consciousness can be one and many. Perhaps people like Nancy were perceiving qualia conducive to joining the expanded consciousness. About 6 years ago, at the Tom Tom Festival, Monty Python's John Cleese presented a panel of experts who have researched NDE reports, cases of apparent reincarnation and deathbed visions. It was the picture of what open-minded skepticism looks like, instead of the usual dismissiveness of materialists who often think of themselves as skeptics. These people, including Dr. Bruce Grayson, whose book After I'm currently reading, have looked at the evidence which has led them to seriously consider the question, is there life after death? Contrary to what has for some time now been popular belief, there is overwhelming evidence strongly suggesting that consciousness survives physical death. Evidence also seems to largely support idealism. There is also evidence to suggest that hallucinations are not quite the same as near-death experiences, as illustrated by the case of a man who attempted suicide by taking an overdose of hospital drugs. Whilst in the body, in a state of pain and dizziness, he hallucinated little people grabbing him and preventing him from seeking help from others. But once he collapsed and found himself out of his body during his NDE, the little people had vanished. He felt better and was thinking clearly. Moreover, he accurately described the physical actions of the doctor who came to his rescue as observed from a disembodied perspective. There are cases where patients meet deceased loved ones through NDEs, and even family members that they had never met before who died before they were born. NDEers also meet people they thought were alive at the time, to their surprise. Friends or family members who had just died a few hours prior to their mystical experiences, and their recent deaths, often taking place several miles away from the hospitals where the NDE patients are situated, are subsequently confirmed by others. There is no materialist explanation for how NDEers knew what took place miles away from where they were. It is baffling how someone with almost no brain activity and no pulse can acquire information about remote events in space and know far more than people with fully functional brains and hearts listening to what their patients have to say. There are also people who seem to recall past lives in great detail that matches the lives of people who died before. This brings up many questions, such as the decades gap between dying and being born again in some of the examples given. Where were they during that time? Were they having a great time in some blissful wonderland before returning to Earth to have their slates wiped clean as confused babies? Did they even experience that gap between death and rebirth as being decades long, or is it the case that temporal perception is different as consciousness transcends both space and time? The more we uncover the more questions emerge. This is a legitimate line of inquiry, and it is no use pretending that we have our thanatology figured out. Materialism has failed on many counts, so we must continue to piece together the clues we get from our extraordinary human experiences and make attempts to refine our metaphysical idealism. We don't even know exactly how everything came to be. The will of the creative principle was free to explore all possible scenarios, as in the so-called beginning. There were no laws and therefore no restrictions. No restrictions means everything is permitted. Perceived laws arose with the emergence of creations and disassociated finite perspectives. Like a child, the will wanted to play with its toys and games, as it were, whilst knowing itself and its infinite potential for experience. Its radiant emptiness brought forth forms it could identify with. Once adopting a finite locus of consciousness, its sense of freedom is considerably reduced, along with memory and knowledge. The will remains intact, but now it feels constrained because it can't even remember the freedom with which it created the world. Our concept of will, which is anthropic, might not be applicable to primordial consciousness. Pure consciousness perhaps has a potential for a will instead. What I mean by this is that it already feels complete in its pristine, luminous mind prior to concepts. It may even have a primordially blissful quality. It's funny that Penrose even posited recently that the quality of pleasure is primal and may be the main driver of evolution, as we observe life forms seeking comfort, peace and happiness, chasing that homely feeling, as it were. But then, what happens which gives rise to the world? Maybe that intrinsic love for manifestation and creation, which wouldn't be a compulsion. Perhaps, because it is unbounded, it allows everything to be. It is possible that primarily, even though it's blissful, peaceful and happy, it becomes curious about its nature whilst simultaneously being in love with its own feeling. And that curiosity begets a narrative of concepts, trying to define itself, bringing into existence contrasting sensations and formulations that emphasize what it's not. Like a process of self-discovery, building a map of itself in a reductionist way. Then it forgets itself in the process, but intuitively tries to find its way back, akin to a meditator lost in thought before seeing through his or her mental illusions and waking up to that pristine stillness. It feels that blissful stillness and then tries to define it with unrestful states of mind. It stirs where vibrations take place. It defines itself by what it's not, intrinsically speaking. A process that is perhaps symbolically captured by the Ouroboros, the tail-eating snake. It's funny that when I stumbled upon that pristine cognition, I had also used the word clarity to try to describe it, but the subsequent narrative, when thoughts returned, made the original state disappear from perception or focus, and the words in answer to my questions about what the state was made it unclear or not enough, leaving me with a sense of ineffability. And even though the word ineffable somewhat applies to that state, it also fails to fully capture it. I could never truly describe that state of pure consciousness. The only way to know it is to realize it, to become it, to experience it. And even though I am not in that state right now, I somehow know it is primarily in all of us, the very core that unites us. It brings to mind an old Sufi proverb: I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and found only God. We often release emotional tension with one fell swoop, uttering terse replies as though the few words used are already packed with all that raw meaning which recipients apparently should understand. We are often eager to instantaneously communicate what we mean whilst neglecting the fact that it takes time to linguistically translate the scope of it. It takes time to assess ourselves and subsequently make attempts to convey what we feel and think. Higher order intentionalities from the neocortex take time, whereas the primordial parts of the brain reflect a more instinctive nature, sure of itself, holistic and spontaneous. Hence Freudian slips. Often when asked a question, the first instinctual reaction from an individual betrays the truth, and liars often pause in order to suppress it, sometimes looking away as though wanting to escape the situation where they are being probed and don't wish to be read closely. Given more time, however, one can formulate an elaborate and convincing dishonest narrative, which is based on facts and plausibility. I try to do my best to keep my biases in check, often reminding myself why I arrived at my present worldview. The reason why I underwent a paradigm shift was precisely because I was searching for the truth. My current position is the only one that makes sense to me. But it is also true that my materialist phase coincided with major depression, near self-destruction, cynicism and nihilism. I had forgotten about the mystery of consciousness in my former doctrine of materialism. It was before I came across this profound statement by Thomas Huxley, how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as the result of irritating nervous system is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. Then things happened and the penny dropped. I felt that something wasn't quite right. Science, reason and philosophy were making me pay close attention to the nature of mind, not just my meditation and lucid dreaming practice. No longer could I also ignore the profundity of some of my experiences either. Experiences hinting at the notion that we are more than what we currently are, and that, having opened the doors of perception, one appears to increase the chances of precognition and telepathy, which I had previously been too quick to dismiss as meaningless coincidences. I was prone to lucid dreaming as a kid before I even knew the term. But I've been seriously exploring my own mind using lucid dreaming for about 15 years now. I am an avid lucid dreamer, often having aha moments where I see right through the illusion, other times jumping into a dream scene directly from the waking state, retaining lucidity, retaining the knowledge that it is only a dream, and remaining awake in the dream world. My dreams are certainly, for the most part, and as far as I can tell, in the domain of my personal mind. But there is certainly another kind of loose intelligence that does what we are often incapable of doing. It thinks outside the box. It connects dots that we think shouldn't be connected. It is wiser and more holistic in contrast to our narrow perspective. There is a book by Robert Wagner, whom I hope to interview soon, called Lucid Dreaming, Gateway to the Inner Self, where he talks about communication with an awareness behind the oniric fabric using lucid dreaming. I highly recommend that book, and the author has certainly been one of my inspirations in using lucid dreaming as a tool to do mental exploration. A psychonaut needs to know how to lucid dream, and then he or she is faced with the task of making mental observations about the character and behaviour of one's own mind, as well as trying to decipher the what, how or why of one's experiences in altered states of consciousness. I used to have lots of dreams about being pursued by feline beasts, and they attacked civilians in nighttime dreamscapes. I could seek refuge by climbing lampposts and trees and then watch other people being victimized below. Upon awakening, I wondered if they represented untamed aspects of myself, perhaps raw desires filled with impatience. One night, I had a dream with big cats chasing me, and I began climbing a tree. I noticed them also climbing, so by instinct I jumped and started flapping my arms, which caused me to fly. This, in turn, made me realize I was dreaming. Having seen through the illusion, I subdued the beasts with superhuman strength and subsequently flew away to enjoy the rest of my lucid dream. Eventually I flew into a massive tunnel containing an oriental market with food stalls, where I enjoyed some exquisite fish and danced with several women in a nightclub to the sound of jazz music before waking up exhilarated. I can be sure of what all of that means. I can't be sure of what all of that means, but I can guess by assessing what the experience meant to me at the time and what its phenomenal appearances evoke in general. Dreams are most likely almost entirely products of our monkey minds, where our egos get in the way of meditative stillness and where metacognition can enable lucid dreaming. Our oniric experiences thus stemming from our personal unconscious. I once found art pieces in a lucid dream that were strangely familiar, done in my style as I recognized it, and yet I don't remember ever thinking about them or ever making them. It was almost like the lucid dream state was reifying potentials vying for attention and possible realization in waking life. Perhaps ordinary dreaming provides better chances to connect to the collective unconscious, the universal mind, than lucid dreaming does. The latter being more focused on personal mental creations, where critical thinking applies in order to maintain the state and emphasizing the ego in relation to the rest of the dream. I'm only saying this because of my card experiment, which I describe in one of my previous videos with the Seven of Clubs image, called Epistemological Idealism versus Conceptual Realism, Our Illusory Reality, NDEs, and the Lucid Dream Experiment. The non-lucid seemed to provide me with knowledge I couldn't have known by conventional means, but then again I also had an OBE exit-initiated lucid dream, where I apparently perceived events in my neighbourhood that took place 2 weeks later. An ostensibly precognitive out-of-body experience. So maybe lucidity doesn't matter much other than metacognitive focus. Or maybe my egoic whirlpool, as it were, just happened to be more porous and acquired more information from the mind at large than usual. I really can't be sure other than to make observations here using or borrowing terminology from other hypothetical models, such as Kastrup's, as you might have noticed. Sorry, I'm struggling to speak because I've been screaming at the football lately. My vocal cords are a bit itchy. Anyway, what was I saying? So, I can only use other models to try and figure out, and I don't really have the patience to come up with my own model, but I find Kastrup's analytic idealism quite convincing. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but there are certainly things that I have found for sure in 15 years of lucid dreaming. Excuse me. In lucid dreams, your self closely matches that of waking life, save for the occasional bizarre thinking illustrated by Alan Worsley in his lab experience. After all, he was worried about his equipment getting wet in the rain, even though he knew he was dreaming, which is odd. But in meditation, the narrative of who you currently identify with can disappear, and you are revealed to be a naked awareness at the core. The true self, as they say. For this to happen, all thinking and memories need to disappear, and cognition is uncorrupted by mental constructs. The bliss that is then experienced lies in that ineffable clarity. Pardon me, excuse me. It's a real happiness that doesn't depend on any events that pander to the ego. The opposite of a lucid dream, in which one might indulge oneself by seeking to manifest fantasies, often of a sexual nature, such as a teenager or young adult seeking an orgy. But lucid dreaming can certainly be used to garner insights. The image on the screen illustrates a wake-initiated lucid dream I had years ago, where I lacked control. On a particular night, I was down with the flu and a raging headache, which disrupted my sleep. One of the pros of this disruption was the REM sleep rebound that I entered into, characterized by rich hypnagogic hallucinations that eventually led me to appear in an inaccurate replica of my house. By the way, REM or REM stands for rapid eye movement. What was striking about this experience is that I no longer felt sick, as though the dream world had restored my health. I felt relieved to be lucid dreaming, but as I began to perambulate my oniric environment, I was soon pestered by small grotesque creatures that I came to call Quasimodos. These dreamlings insisted on grabbing my legs, making me notice that I was wearing grey PJs. I don't even have them in waking life. They're non-existent. And as they attempted to climb my body, I felt myself gradually shrink to their level and drained of energy, which prompted me to instinctively break free and get away from them. The Quasimodos gave chase, and no matter where I hid, they seemed to find me, like I was some kind of magnet for them. And I was annoyed that they were ruining my healthy break from the reality of the waking world. Once awake, I wondered about their origins or what they represented in my mind, and to this day I strongly suspect that they were subconscious personifications of the maladies that afflicted me at the time. Even though I no longer felt ill in the lucid dream, my theory is that the unpleasant sensations never truly left me, and were, instead, externalized in dream space, manifesting visually in a more symbolic and mythical way. Lucid dreaming is, after all, an altered state of consciousness in which what is perceived is largely unconstrained by sensory input. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that the absence of perceiving or identifying with the afflicted physical body that lay in bed translated into the wishful oniric narrative of having a healthy new body that was up and about, which still couldn't escape discomfort in dreamland because the illness in waking life is still physically real. The lucid dream about the Quasimodos also appears to be the manifestation of a subconscious wish to get away from pain and discomfort, which eerily lends credit to the Freudian theory as presented by Professor Mark Solms when he was interviewed by my friend Matt Gray on the Cheltenham and UK Philosophers channel. I really recommend that you watch that conversation. It's genius. I don't know how and if the theory fits with what's happening with near-death experiences, but my guess is that these are part of a different kettle of fish. I've never had an NDE, but I did have something similar over 20 years ago at the Harrow campus of Westminster University. Certainly not the result of a physically traumatic accident or life-threatening health issue to the point of being on the verge of death, like the majority of NDEs. But I did collapse in front of a urinal in the toilet of an on-campus pub called the Undercroft as a result of having had too much skunk weed and alcohol. So I felt sick, woozy, and about to faint as I walked towards the urinal. Next, I found myself blissfully resting on a fluffy cloud without a care in the world. As soon as I questioned where I was, I found myself moving over the heads of people drinking and socialising in the pub. I seemed to move from one frame of space to the next. It wasn't a continuous motion. It was more like I was teleporting several times as I willed myself forwards, like I was mouse trailing above people's heads. I could hear them nattering away, but nobody looked up in my direction. I was like a fly that nobody noticed and felt extremely peaceful just observing what was going on around me. There were no thoughts about myself. I was just observing. Suddenly, I'm back in the loo, feeling uncomfortable and peeved, lying on the floor with my head on this stranger's lap as he desperately tried to reanimate me by repeatedly slapping me in the face. Eventually I got up and fully recovered with a glass of water that my friends gave me in the pub, and what had transpired from substance abuse was more akin to an out-of-body experience really than the autoscopic experience of an NDE. I never ended up in hospital and didn't need medical assistance despite collapsing, but at the same time I was certainly on a self-destructive path. If I had carried on like I was, I probably wouldn't be here today. I might have gone through some tunnel or vortex and joined the light. I certainly no longer buy the nonsensical idea, as I did then as a materialist, that you die and that's it, there's nothing. I think that it's stupid. I was stupid back then for dismissing experiences like the one I've just described as mere hallucinations, that the probable explanation would always be something that had to dovetail nicely with my physicalist worldview. Since I changed my mind about the nature of reality and came to find idealist metaphysics more compelling, I have been forced to revise my past experiences sorry on the extraordinary side. I have looked back with wonder and sometimes dread. If you think I'm rejecting the nothingness hypothesis of death because Freud must have been right and I'm afraid of non-existence, think again. As a materialist, I used to tell people that dying is the liberation from everything, that one becomes untouchable, as nothing can no longer befall you, that nothing can affect you because there is no longer an experiencer to be burdened with anything, that life, the bully, can no longer find you. At one point, the materialist outlook brought me comfort when I looked back on a particular childhood experience that now brings me dread. But before I recount it, let me tell you something about nothing. Nothing isn't. Nothing is what is not. In fact, to say nothing is to commit a semantic oxymoron. Nothing isn't. Nothing never was. Nothing in existence is inconceivable because it's no thing and equates with non-existence. Nothing is present right now, as it were, by not being. conveyed by the contrasting fact that something is. In quantum theory, a state of nothingness is so unstable, as theoretical physicists say, that the possibility for something to emerge is a probabilistic inevitability. This physical nothingness isn't what we humans imagine nothing to be, which is an impossible nothingness that exists only as an abstraction. The one from which all things truly come resides in ultimate reality. The source is so simple that it is best described as est in potentia ad liquid. It's the potential to become a manifest something. Simulations of the quantum foam might illustrate such potential for becoming. It's the potential to become something, not nothing, because nothing can never be. Nothing isn't anything. The physical nothingness that really exists is a cosmic blueprint that naturally runs away from simplicity in this realm of manifestation and spreads in all directions like water spilt on the floor. Now, to get to my earlier point, I had a traumatic childhood and remember a peculiar instance of being engulfed by darkness and feeling pushed down by a force that I fought hard against desperately, for I felt that not doing so would mean the cessation of my being. It's a terrifying experience. By the way, bear in mind at the time that my parents were fighting a lot. They were arguing every day. My father was hitting my mum almost on a daily basis. And yeah, they were on the verge of divorce. So when this experience happened, it was I felt like I was being suffocated, really. But it was frightening, even more so because it felt like something unnatural, something evil. I felt like I was hanging by a thread and felt like I was somehow drowning in that darkness. The darkness was some kind of hell. This darkness completely took over my field of awareness quite abruptly and took me by surprise as I was sitting at the table playing with a toy car as my mother cooked dinner. As soon as it happened, I knew that it wasn't a case of someone switching off the lights. I knew that something was seriously wrong, and my panic grew as I felt a force pushing me down and somehow threatening my existence in the world. When I finally regained my normal vision and senses after what felt like an agonizing eternity, I was crying in my father's arms and did not know why. It was like someone had been crying on my behalf, using my body. My mother was sprinkling me with what she believed to be holy water and uttering prayers. Because I was a child, about 7 years old, my mother simply told me I had been ill in the aftermath, but was now fully recovered. Later, in my teens, I was informed that I had been possessed by an evil spirit and had to be exorcised. That was my Christian mother's spiritualistic interpretation of what happened and what she had observed. According to her, I had turned violent out of the blue for no reason, screaming, growling and cursing everyone, before finally calming down with her prayers and her holy water, which appeared to have the effect of returning me to my typical self. I do not recall behaving in such a manner because I simply experienced a pitch-black suffocating field of awareness. Eventually, I came across a scientific magazine in my teens that sparked my interest in science and seemed to provide a perfectly good explanation. In a nutshell, it made a case for the theory that whenever there is relentless and prolonged trouble in a household, young minds, or vulnerable minds, are affected. the child will come to feel like a scared animal that has been cornered and has nowhere to run. So the only option is to turn around and attack like a mad dog. I think the amygdala and the fight or flight sensation has a role to play there. In that moment, a primordial part of the brain takes over as the conscious default state of the young personality is instinctually deemed insufficient to cope or deal with the perceived problem. If it can't deal with your ordeal, then a different mode comes into play, comes online. My parents were about to get divorced. My father was a degenerate gambler and a habitual wife beater. I wanted him to disappear. In fact, prior to what my mum believes to have been a demonic possession, I had repeatedly screamed at my father to go away for good after he hit her. I was in such a state that it had taken me probably a good hour before I stopped, before I snapped out of my hysterical mode. Bear in mind, this is before the possession-like experience, so it actually took me a while to calm down, to snap out of my anger. I was so angry at my father. I actually felt like I hated him, and now I can't say the same. I just kind of feel sorry for him, but I want nothing to do with him today. Yeah, so I eventually stopped, and it happened. I stopped screaming after he eventually left for work. He was actually getting ready to leave, but he was screaming and hitting my mum, and then I just couldn't take it anymore, and you know, I started screaming at him. But yeah, once he was gone, I calmed down and was happy to play with my toys. But perhaps a part of me knew he would eventually come back and it wouldn't be good. The dissociative experience remained somewhat of a mystery to me. Perhaps I was overwhelmed by my Jungian shadow temporarily, an anger I couldn't repress any longer. The beast could no longer be ignored, and it came to the surface just when I least expected it. Perhaps, you know, that kind of anger, that urge to do something about what was happening at home. Perhaps I did have a dream like that. I don't remember, but it's funny how intense experiences of fear and dread and panic seem to have a lasting impact, and they're the most memorable ones. But yeah, if I did have dreams around that time, it wouldn't surprise me if I dreamt of feline beasts, you know, lions. You know, my anger would probably have a feline representation in one of my dreams. It's just an interesting thought I've just had, an interesting observation, because I have had dreams like that as an adult in situations that made me feel angry, and then, you know, on that same day, you know, went to bed, fell asleep, and dreamt of feline beasts. So yeah. So it's like beasts within me that couldn't be ignored, and perhaps that's what possessed me. Who knows? But the thing is, it didn't happen when you know, my parents were having an altercation. It happened after, once I had calmed down, and you know, and I was joyously playing with a toy at the dinner table. I actually remember feeling happy before that darkness just took over, just took me by surprise. I was playing at the dinner table as I waited for my mum to dish up. For the longest time, I was happy with the plausible explanation in the Science magazine for a number of reasons. First, it meant that I was never possessed by an evil spirit, and so I was relieved Pardon me. Once I began to become more scientifically minded in my teens, it actually brought me comfort. I was relieved because it really meant that I hadn't been possessed by some kind of demon. You know, that my mum was wrong. That, you know, I was beginning to realise, I was at an age where I was beginning to realise that my mum is a fallible human being. She also makes mistakes like everyone else. You know, I was maturing. So that's one thing. Secondly, I noticed how my mum's beliefs in spiritualism and voodoo were often met with skepticism and ridicule from other family members, friends and acquaintances. Science was mostly respected and intellect very much praised. My younger self wasn't just persuaded by scientific arguments alone. There was also a certain appeal about science and reason. Being hard-nosed, no-nonsense and level-headed exuded intelligence and earned respect. So maybe these are the primary reasons why, unlike my mum, I moved away from religious beliefs and embraced a scientific outlook as well as a materialist stance, as this one has been in vogue for a long time now. Materialism also means that there are no real demons out to get me. Under idealist metaphysics, actually Castrop also was, when he was a physicalist, he was relieved because he'd had some experiences or dreams about some demon chasing him, and once he began to see that materialism is really untenable, and he made some observations that were pointing to idealist metaphysics. Now it's kind of brought that dread back, because there's a chance that within his metaphysics the demon is real. So under idealist metaphysics there is a spine-chilling, blood-curdling chance that a real entity took over my body as a child. The thought is terrifying. Much later, as I came across Carl Jung's ideas of individuation and the analogous alchemical concept of nigredo, where the active testing and blackening of the prima materia responsible for the unconscious unleashes all manner of demons to be confronted in the realm of the mind, you know, it started to give me a kind of a psychological theory, which also sounds plausible. Suddenly everything began to make sense to me again, you know, another plausible narrative. Even today there is still a tendency to look at all my dreams through a Jungian lens, considering both the personal and the collective. But I also try to look at things from an unbiased perspective, as free of preconceived ideas as I can muster. I must say that I learn about myself both in dreams and waking life, and try to understand my psychical makeup, sorry. I have also experienced instances of meaningful coincidences that Jung would undoubtedly have called synchronicities. One of them was quite recent and striking. I was watching an NDE report on the Coming Home channel with my wife about a Navy diver drowning and having a mystical experience before being rescued at sea, and I remarked to her that it reminded me of the veridical movie A Perfect Storm starring George Clooney. Once it was over, the latest Making Sense video came up on my feed where Sebastian Junger is interviewed by Sam Harris about war, psychedelics, near-death experiences and death itself. When I decided to Google the name, I found that Junger is the author of the book A Perfect Storm, which the film is based on. Moreover, Jung had an NDE himself where he encountered his deceased father inviting him to join him. The experience made Jung ponder, as an atheist, the possibility of an afterlife, which is the subject of his latest book, In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. You might dismiss it as a meaningless coincidence, and perhaps, statistically speaking, neither the definitive dismissal of the concept of synchronicity nor its affirmation can ultimately be proved. But it is undeniable that its psychological impact inspired awe and was quite meaningful to me at the time. Certainly from my perspective, it was a meaningful coincidence with the very definition of synchronicity. In The Universal One by Walter Russell, we find the following statements. Quote, "Life is the effect produced on the substance of mind by the sequence of alternating electromagnetic pulsations which constitute the process of thinking." Unquote. And another quote is, "Matter is light gravitationally assembled into the appearance of form and radially disassembled into the disappearance of form." Unquote. And another excerpt, quote, "Matter and mind and light and energy are eternal. They are constant. They are cause. Form and motion are illusions. They are fleeting. They are effects." Unquote. I recommend that you look up Mellon Thomas Benedict's PowerPoint presentation of his near-death experience, where he encounters the light and asks questions about reality. The light then splits into two columns, each containing a person. The left column contains Darius Dinshah, author of Let There Be Light, which is about spectrochrome therapy, which was published way before scientists discovered that red light coupled with green tea can prevent dementia. The right column contained Walter Russell, who spoke about science, making some accurate predictions ahead of time. Spoke about metaphysics, spirituality, and fractals. He authored the Universal One, which I've just mentioned, which I've started reading in audio format. It talks about everything being light, talks about polarities, frequencies, and is pretty much in line with the principles of the Kabbalion and metaphysical idealism. Russell predicted that the following elements would be found: deuterium, tritium, neptunium, and plutonium. Nikola Tesla, another genius, was so impressed by Walter Russell's ideas about the nature of reality and cosmic dynamics that he advised Russell to keep his discoveries hidden away for thousands of years. Tesla didn't think humanity was ready for Russell's profound insights. Federico Fagin, who invented the first microprocessor, and I've mentioned him enough times, and especially in a past video, recently published a book called Irreducible, which I'd very much like to get my hands on, and he says the following, quote, "The collapse of the wave function doesn't exist. We had to introduce it to explain why we can go from the quantum to the classical. But in this other context, it is simply a decision of free will of the fields to communicate whatever symbol appears in space and time. If this field operates a body which straddles both realities, because our bodies are quantum classical bridges between the world of meaning and the world of symbols, and it communicates with both, then consciousness doesn't act when the body does. And as consciousness doesn't interfere with the action of the body, it appears as decoherence, as something that is reproducible and can be predicted. But if consciousness intervenes, then it can no longer be predicted because it's a logarithmic. We have had evidence for this for a long time. Even David Bohm said this much, quote, "Mass is a phenomena of connecting light rays which go back and forth, sort of freezing them into a pattern, so matter, as it were, is condensed to frozen light." Even Einstein had some hint of that. You could say that when we come to light, we are coming to the fundamental activity in which existence has its ground. Light, in its generalized sense, not just ordinary light, is the means by which the entire universe unfolds into itself. Particles are ripples on this infinite ocean of light. The mind may have a structure similar to the universe, and in the underlying movement we call empty space, there is actually a tremendous energy, a movement. The particular forms which appear in the mind may be analogous to the particles, and getting to the ground of the mind may be felt as light." Unquote. The world is an illusion, as Bohm points out. Consciousness creates illusions through mentation. Out of illusory distinctions, concepts and beliefs are born. Once this is in place, we are already blind to the truth of oneness and unity. Kant may have made a point with his conceptual map that includes a dichotomy between noumena and phenomena, but ultimately it is Berkeley's immaterialism that reminds us to be epistemologically consistent. And now I leave you with one final quote by William Blake. Quote, "When the doors of perception are cleansed, men will see things as they truly are, infinite." Thank you very much for listening. Apologies for my gruff voice and constant coughing. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.